Hi, and welcome to Dipping It Out with Lucy, the podcast that opens up the discussion around domestic abuse. I am very fortunate this lovely sunny Friday morning to be sitting down with Michelle Eldin. Michelle is a recruitment specialist, but not only that, she is also an author and she has a chapter coming out in a new book very soon. So I will hand over to Michelle to explain a bit more about what she does. And good morning, Michelle.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, it's lovely to speak to you, and good morning, everyone that's listening to this. My name, as Lucy said, is Michelle Eldin. My main focus is in recruitment, is my business, but through lived experience, I'm also really passionate about supporting women after domestic abuse. I have a very small but sort of private, confidential Facebook group called A New You, and that is also on Instagram. And as Lucy said, just through my own experiences in 2021, I co-authored a book which is called Hear Her Raw. And then excitingly, I have a book coming out actually next weekend, so
Wow.
3rd of May, in a book called the Start Over series. And in that chapter within the book, I just talk about my experience through the family court and with the aim of obviously helping other protective parents on their journey, whether they're going through that or perhaps been through that, and just try and help people, understand that, everything is temporary and just trying to really add some kind of positivity to what can be, as we both know, sadly, a really, really difficult experience for many people.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think what you've really put beautifully there is it is temporary. And it's so hard for people to see that when you're in the midst of it, when you're in the mire of it all, it's so hard to see that it is temporary and things will progress, things will move forward, and it does not. I wouldn't always say it necessarily gets better, but it does move forward, and you don't stay where you are because obviously the children get older, things
Yeah.
change. And I love the way you say protective parents. I don't think anybody's been on yet who's used that term. And I think that's really important for people to understand is I think with the family court, one of the main issues that I've come across when I talk to people is it's that idea that it's conflict. You know, these are two parents
Yes.
in
Yeah.
conflict. There's conflict, it's toxic, it's this, all these words being bandied around. Whereas actually, it's one parent trying to protect their children from an abuser, the
Yes.
top and bottom of it, and
Literally that.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think, as you rightly said, Lucy, it's the language that's used, isn't it? And I think within, just from my own personal experience, but also just having spoken to obviously people that have been through similar situations, it's how you are obviously treated within the systems, but also the language that's used, which sadly isn't very fair sometimes, isn't very sympathetic, empathetic, and that can really have a big impact on you because most of us are actually quite confident in our stories, i.e. we've been through this, that's wrong, and kind of we want to help protect our children, as you said, but actually the system sadly sometimes makes us feel that we've done something wrong and almost twists that narrative.
yeah,
And that is where it becomes really difficult, doesn't it? Because then you start to question yourself, obviously completely wrongly, but question your own kind of motives, question if you're doing the right thing, or perhaps you should have done this. And then it just really deflects from your own kind of healing journey after abuse, your self-confidence, your identity, because we all kind of have that gut instinct, don't we, to know
yeah.
actually I'm doing the right thing here by trying to support my children and support yourself as much as you can at the same time. But often the system sadly doesn't acknowledge that, doesn't it?
No, and you're right. You just got me thinking there about at the very beginning, I think for a lot of people that they believe that the system will understand. And I think that's one of the biggest kind of falsehoods, isn't it? That
Yes, yes,
people go in with the idea that, well, justice. So clearly justice will be done and they will see this person for who they are. But actually, because an abuser is so good at being charming is disarming and all those sort of terms again that we use, is they don't see the system doesn't see them for what they are and who they are. And so the victim and survivor feels, well, hang on a minute, I was coming in here with the pure intention of X, Y, and Z, and actually now it's all been twisted. And yeah,
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 and it's quite scary actually. Obviously, firstly, how that can happen, but secondly, the impact it can have on an individual. And I think my advice, I guess, again, having been through that, is just to really almost to protect yourself in terms of like self-care, self-love, and just the only thing sadly that we can sometimes control is ourselves, isn't it? And how we kind of rebuild ourselves. I mentioned sort of earlier the healing journey, kind of what that looks like. you know, most of us are pretty much at rock bottom when we come out of that relationship, and even through the family court system. And I think the only thing we can really control is how we treat ourselves, and just, you know, kind of rebuilding step by step. You know, it doesn't sadly happen overnight, does it? It can take
No,
months, if not years. But I think one thing I learned through my experiences, the more I learned to love myself again, look after myself, treat myself well, speak to myself nicely as well.
yes.
You know, the more I was able to face those challenges with more resilience and strength. And I guess for me, that's a real key point of advice that, you know, I'd like to give anyone watching this.
100%. I could not agree with you more. And again, it's an area that's overlooked. We often, I think I did something recently around the myth of this sort of just leave, and this idea that, well, you've left now, so clearly everything should be hunky dory, life should be perfect. But you're right, the self-care, we talk a lot about well-being, we talk a lot about these buzzwords, but do we really understand it? Do we really understand? And I think unless you've been through that experience of something like the family court, for many people, and society as a whole will not appreciate, it's not only psychologically exhausting, it's physically exhausting. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And it can take a long, long time because there's the build up to it, then there's the going through it, then there's the other side. And particularly, I guess, if you're going through post separation abuse, it won't just stop there. It will repeat itself. The pattern repeats, and you're back again, and you're back again, and breaches of the order, etc., etc. And it goes on and on in a vicious cycle. And you're right. You have to 100%. That takeaway is self-care.
Yeah, definitely. And I think sadly, you know, obviously within that abusive relationship, we're often taught that we don't matter, you know, our voice doesn't matter, or, you know, we don't matter as individuals on a literally a real simplistic level. You know, our being sometimes doesn't matter, sadly, through whether that's through being lied to, manipulated, or, you know, the literal abuse itself. And I think the more we can learn, actually, you know, again, that self-care, self-love. And although we kind of, we're taught, even as women, I sometimes think we're taught actually we have to spread our love to everyone else around us, make sure everyone else is okay first. And especially if we've got children or perhaps elderly parents, or, you know, we're trying to support, that love has to go to everyone else. And obviously it does. We're all caring, you know, loving beings. But I think we also need to reflect that love back on ourselves, you know, whether that's through, let's say, affirmations, or just something simple like a hot bath every evening, or sat down with a cup of tea and just spending some time, 10 minutes a day, just being, because life is so busy, isn't it? Let alone when you've kind of, as you said, come out of that fight or flight mode, where you're just mentally and physically completely drained. You know, just small practices, like small steps, can really, really make a difference.
Absolutely. I think you're right. It is, even if it sounds so simple to people, but even if it's like you say, make a cup of tea. Because I've talked about this before. You may not have been allowed to pick your own tea bags. The
Yeah,
brand of tea bags that you have at home could have been controlled by the ex-partner. So now something as simple as that can make you feel like you're starting to have more control over your life. And it's interesting you said, because just talking about this particular aspect of it, and that self-care was, I had a lady come on called Ruth Dodsworth, and she's an ITV Wales journalist and reporter, and she'd experienced coercive control, and she was talking about when she was out of the relationship, that she'd never had control over her finances. So to the outside world, it's like, well, she's on TV, she must be doing well, she must, etc. But actually, her ex-partner had controlled all the finances. So when it came to her mum giving her some cash to go and have a coffee in a coffee shop, she'd never felt more independent and free. And it's something so, so simple. And I use that in my sessions as an example because it's so true. Something people go, well, what? Going for a cup of coffee? We take those things for granted
oh, we
as
do, don't
society.
we? Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think it's like you said, it's that gratitude, isn't it? And again, it's
Yeah.
one thing, I guess. You know, I remember when I first got divorced, a friend of mine was like, you know, maybe try and practice gratitude, because I was literally, you know, rock bottom, single mum, and just didn't know how to move forward. To be fair, and he was like, well, why don't you do this? And I was like, oh, don't be silly. Like, that sounds a lot of old, you know, gobbledygook. And to be honest, I did it because I was like, well, actually, what have I got to lose? I might as
Yeah.
well try. And, you know, if it helps, it helps. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I tried it. And genuinely, within weeks, I could feel the shift in my mindset from that very negative, I can't, how can I never will, you know, I'm not good enough, I haven't got this, I haven't got that, to actually, like you said, I can sit and have a cup of tea in peace now. I can put the TV on, I can
Yeah.
go for a walk when I want, I can meet my friends. And like you said, it's appreciating those simple things, isn't it? And it's surprising. And don't get me wrong, it's sometimes not easy to look at that, because we are sometimes stuck on
Yes.
that of what the abusers often told us, like you can't, you won't, you'll never be able to kind of narrative. But the more we can almost train, I guess, our mind to think, actually, today I've got out of bed, or as you said, had a cup of tea in peace, or I've had a hot shower. Those kind of real simple practices over time, can make a real difference.
Yeah, they can, I agree. I think, and it is those baby steps, and it is just taking those very small steps to keep moving forward. And I think as well, when I've spoken to people. So if I, for example, if I've done a session and we have a conversation afterwards, and somebody says, "Can I chat to you after?" No problem. And what comes up a lot is people will say, but I feel like I've failed because I took a step backwards and something happened, something triggered me, something, whether it's the abuser as contact, whatever it is, the family court, etc., whoever, whatever system's involved, they feel like they're failing. And I always try and say to them, you're not failing, you're human. And nobody, we're not in some, I always think of it as like, you see all these films about abuse. And by the end of it, everything's perfect, hunky dory after 2 hours of watching this film. That's not real life. That's not how it works.
So
And you
exactly
are going
that.
to take steps back. And it is going to be difficult. And like you say, sometimes looking at those areas, it is difficult to think to yourself, how did this happen? How did I get here? But it isn't your fault. And taking steps back isn't a failure. It's accepting that you're human.
Yeah, literally that, Lisa. I think, as you rightly said, it's a roller coaster ride, isn't it? And I think in life in general, we're taught we must be pushing forward. We must be doing something really positive
Yes.
or really miraculous every day of our life. And actually,
Yeah.
the reality in I say normal situation, the most sensitive way, isn't that, let alone when you've come out of an abusive relationship or going through the family court or coming out the other side of family court. It's just not realistic, is it? And I think the more we learn to kind of appreciate that in life in general, the better and less pressure we then put on ourselves. And I think, me just for example, 5 years kind of down the line, after my divorce, I still have days where I'm not as productive as other days, because maybe I just don't have the energy, or like you
Yeah.
said, I may get a message from my ex-partner that kind of makes me feel a bit, oh God, here we go again, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And then I have to take a step back. Maybe that for me it looks like going for a walk. That's my kind of, release, shall we say. And I sometimes do a bit of breath work, things like that, to kind of bring my senses down. But I guess the more we can kind of almost teach ourselves that actually not every day is going to be perfect, sadly. We're still healing, and that can take time. And yes, one day we may feel we take 2 steps forward, the next day we may feel 2 steps back, and that's perfectly fine. It's like you said, releasing ourselves from that guilt that we should be okay now. They've gone, so we should be doing X, Y, and Z. I think actually no, it goes back to that being kind to ourselves and just taking the pressure off, doesn't it? And almost releasing that control, I think, sometimes of that healing journey, that kind of often what will be will be. We can't control other people's behaviors, actions, words, but we can control ourselves, how we treat ourselves, and how we kind of respect and love ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. And it is about that self-love, isn't it? As much as it's about self-care, it is about self-love, because that's something that the individual has been starved of for so long. And you do hear a lot, I think, of people saying, and they, again, it's that guilt factor, is, but I still have feelings for that. I've heard that so many times over the years, but of course you do, because your feelings were genuine, your feelings were real. What you were putting into that relationship was honest and authentic. But what the perpetrator was putting into that relationship was not honest or authentic, and it was power and control. And learning to love yourself and realize that actually that's a really powerful gift to have, is to be able to love unconditionally. It's not a failing in you, it's actually an incredible gift to have.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think it's, as you said, it's releasing that guilt, isn't it? There was been something wrong with me, or I could have done this, or if I'd just done that a bit different, or they said this, so if I think actually, like you said, no, it doesn't, it's not like that, is it? And I think as, people that have experienced abuse often, and this is just from my own kind of research, I guess, often abusers will choose, for want of a better way of putting it, people that are empathetic, kind, caring, loving, And not that I wish it upon anyone, don't get me wrong, but I think, like you said, we have to kind of almost give ourselves that love to go, I'm a wonderful human being here. I've loved this person, given the circumstances, I have loved them, I've cared for them, and I think I say congratulate ourselves loosely, because I know how easy it is to beat ourselves up in that relationship, after that relationship, to kind of be that inner critique, because sadly, it's natural, but also, again, because of what we've been sort of conditioned to within that abusive relationship, we tend to feel like it's our fault, and we've done something wrong. Whereas I think, like you said, we just have to look at ourselves with that compassion, and again, that self-care, and just go, no, I've given the circumstances, I've done my best in that situation, because it's obviously it's not easy being an abusive relationship. B, we often don't realize sometimes, if it's emotionally abusive, that is actually what is going on, sadly, because it's so manipulative. And secondly, it's not as easy just to go, well, I've done with this now, off I'm going to go, because we all know the reality is it's not like that, is it? It doesn't work like that. And I think people that are on the other side of that, i.e. they have left, that is a hugely courageous and brave step in itself, isn't it? Just to leave that relationship.
It is. And again, I think you're right. If we can accept that the leaving part as well is so, it's hard to put into words, isn't it? Because again, if I'm talking about this, I will say, if you are in a position to leave, or if you have been in, and it sounds awful to say, but fortunate enough to leave, and people go, what do you mean fortunate? Many people can't. Many people don't have the resources, the financial resources, the psychological strength to do it. Or there's so many areas where you can say, actually, or again, another classic where the perpetrator will say, well, I'll kill myself, or I'll kill you, or I'll kill the children, etc., if you leave. How do you leave that situation? And that's where I think, as society, looking out from the outside looking in, I think there needs to be a lot more compassion and understanding that it isn't, try putting yourself in that person's shoes. I had this conversation with my husband last night, and it's funny because we were talking about trying to understand someone's situation. And I was saying one of the things you should never do is say, I know, because you don't know. You're not in that person. I've never experienced your experience, vice versa. And so you can have understanding, and you can say, yes, there is a thread and there's similarities, but you're taking away that person's experience by saying because you haven't walked in their shoes.
No, exactly that. And every situation is different, isn't it? Abuse looks differently, perpetrators act differently, although there are common threads in terms of, I think, patterns of behaviour often. The circumstances surrounding that, i.e. environment, perhaps children, maybe even pets, or, lots of different circumstances, isn't there? I don't think it's, as you rightly said, and I must admit, I haven't thought about this before. It was just kind of brought it to my attention. But I think, we don't know, do we? Quite rightly, it's unfair and very judgmental, actually, to go, actually, I think we have a level of understanding, like you said, but actually to say to someone, oh, I get that, and I kind of, it's not right, is it? And I think that's where the kind of the podcasts like this, Lucy, to be fair, where we can have open conversations, people may be able to resonate with little bits of it. Some bits they may be like, oh no, my situation's a bit different, because whatever that looks like. But I think the more open and honest we can be about domestic abuse, patterns of behavior, our own experiences, I think the more we can teach people from a sort of victim perspective, survivor perspective, or even the perpetrators, to teach people, increase their education around maybe like red flags, those patterns of behavior, kind of how the situation perhaps like play out, i.e., what the future may look like, what current circumstances are. And again, I think that always supports learning, but also supports people in terms of literally, knowing they're not alone and they've got the community, which I think when you're in it yourself, it can feel really lonely, can't it? Like, it's just me, I can't speak to anyone because no one will understand. Well, we do understand, but absolutely, as you said, every situation is different, isn't it?
And it's only, after I had the conversation with my husband, I just dropped the mic and walked away and went, there you go, just say it, just say it. Exactly. And that when you're in a healthy relationship, when you can have those very kind of deep conversations and then agree to disagree, agree to go, and then you've kind of won the lottery in some ways when you go, okay,
Yes,
yeah, we can have that
exactly.
conversation, and he doesn't have to see my perspective. I don't have to see, well, understand each other's perspectives, but you don't have to agree. But I was still right. No, I'm joking.
Now,
Joking.
and it's important, isn't it, to be able to have
Yeah,
those healthy, opinions, isn't it? In essence,
yeah.
not everyone's opinion's the same, and that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, and again, it comes back to that power and control that the perpetrator has had. Even something as simple as your own opinion on something. You're not, for what many victims and survivors say is for an easy life, for to not have to walk on eggshells. I just agree. I just bring a fine fact because they didn't want the what they knew was coming next. Which in a lot of people's heads when you say that, I think the problem again with when we call it domestic violence is people have this idea when I say those words that what's coming next, that it's going to be a punch in the face or a strangulation. I'm not saying it isn't, and in many terrible terrible situations it is that, but it's also for a lot of people it's the non-violence. That's why I use the term domestic abuse, and I've noticed you do too, and for me that's the term that I prefer, because I think for society to understand what could be coming next for that person if they're walking on eggshells could be that constant barrage of you're wrong, and living with that day in day out, and calling you every name under the sun and belittling you and putting you down, that verbal abuse, that can be as terrifying and as soul destroying as every other aspect of abuse. And I think
I
that's
agree.
really important that people understand. We don't always have to think, oh well, what's coming next? It must be this because I've seen it when I see every poster of a woman cowering and a child doing this. And yes, of course, there are those aspects of it, but it's a lot more subtle than that.
Oh, I agree. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. It's a psychological impact, isn't it? And I think, someone who's had that kind of marriage, emotionally, psychologically abusive marriage, I think for me, it was that, as you described it loosely, but then also the flip side was the silent treatment, kind of
yes,
like, oh, me trying to resolve things, work things through, have conversations, and there was just nothing. And as someone who, I get in any marriage, people approach things differently, don't they? Don't
yeah,
get me wrong. But I think for me, that was part of the abuse looking back, that, I wanted to fix things and, have open conversations. And the door was always shut as if I didn't exist, as if it didn't matter that I was kind of a certain type of person for trying to have open conversations. And I think, it takes many forms, doesn't it? That emotional abuse. It can be, like you rightly said, the kind of the manipulation side, the kind of the name calling, the shouting, etc. Or it can be, the silent treatment, the kind of almost nullifying feelings, your
yeah,
emotions, your thoughts, your voice, as you said before. It's so many different facets, isn't there? That
yeah,
sadly, I think that's what makes it difficult sometimes, even as someone in it, to identify actually is this abuse? Because one minute you've got a Jekyll, next minute you've got a Mr. Hyde, and it's
yes.
almost understanding which, who is your partner. Are they Mr. Nice? Are they Mr. Mean? It's, and
Yeah.
that in itself is a roller coaster.
You're right, and what I love about what you've just said as well is when you're in it and you're the victim at the time, it's so hard for the victim to see, it's so hard for you to have seen what was going on. And then we expect society to understand. And that's where I do, to a certain extent, have I don't think the word's compassion, but I have understanding when people go, well, that doesn't affect me. That doesn't affect my workplace, or that doesn't affect my family. But how do you know? Because if somebody who's in it doesn't realize that that's abuse, then and but we now, when you have that, as I say, when the fog's lifted, you do understand, but it's trying to say to other people, but now I need you to understand. I need you to see why I've struggled to come into work, or I've had to take days holiday to go to family court because I didn't want anyone knowing because I'm mortified, or whatever the situation is. Um, and not having that spot, it's so important, I think, and that's where things definitely need to change dramatically, is that understanding from the outside, because if from the inside it's difficult to understand, from the outside it's a million times harder.
Oh, absolutely. And it's like you touched on earlier, that educational piece, isn't it? Because I think, again, I guess in particular, let's say the family courts, for example, or the professionals involved in that. And I know they do receive an element of training, but just from my understanding, I don't think that's enough or in depth.
Minimal. Yeah,
And I think because sadly, the perpetrators of abuse are very manipulative, very charming, very friendly. Again, it goes back to that Jekyll and Hyde character. they are never ever going to be what I call their true selves in that court arena, are they? I.e.,
No.
you know, the user, the name caller, the liar, whatever it be. Whereas I think professionals in that system see the charm, the friendliness, often, you know, quite someone who's calm, you know, kind of very friendly, very likable. And you know, as someone who's sat there knowing what I call the real them, you're like, oh,
Yes.
like, you know, and I
Yeah.
think, like you said, that's why that education is so important, isn't it? Because you can, like, for example, take Darvo, the kind of technique, the
Yeah.
deflection technique, etc. Take that, for example, just that simple. I can see that constantly now because
Mm.
I've taught it myself. In that relationship, I wasn't even aware that was even a thing, but kind of through my own personal education, kind of learned that that's a technique, shall we say, abusers use. But if professionals were aware of that, I would hope they would be able to then go, oh, they've just done X, Y, and Z. Oh, that fits that kind of model of behavior, shall we say. And
Yes.
then it just kind of, and not, again, not saying that everyone kind of uses those techniques, but I think it's just being mindful, isn't it, of that it
It is.
could
Yeah.
be potentially something that this
Yeah.
individual, male or female, could be using within that court arena to try and manipulate the
Yeah.
process.
Yeah, and you're right. You know, for the victim, in that, if anybody who's listening, either to validate their own experience, or if it's somebody that doesn't really understand what, you know, they haven't experienced it, is trying to keep yourself together while somebody is, and because that fog's lifted, because you see that person who they are now, and you're in the position where you're processing all of these things, to then have to stand there and watch somebody. You know, so many people have said to me, this is why I come across looking like X, Y, and Z, because I can see it for what it is and they can't. And it's so frustrating. And you're right, you know, if they had more understanding, and there's to me, there's so many, the words red flag gets used a lot, doesn't it? But there are a lot of red flags. You know, if a lot of it is, say, for example, within the family court, is put on the victim to do X, Y, and Z, but the perpetrator will not adhere to that. Surely, can they not see that that person is basically saying, you won't tell me what to do because I'm in control, I have the power, and it just gets deflected, ignored, and yeah, and it's so, you know, for anybody listening who has experienced it, and I am very fortunate that I have had people in the past say, you know, I feel validated by listening to what you've discussed because I didn't think anyone understood. And going back to what we said before about that, well, no one's experienced what I've experienced, so how can anyone understand? But actually there's levels of understanding within that. Nobody's saying that we understand someone's situation perfectly because it's their experience and we wouldn't take that away from them. But actually there are so many threads. And I think it was Sam Beckinsale said a while ago, it's like there's a blueprint. I watched something that she talked about, and it's like I mean, and not to belittle it in any way, but we also have to sometimes have that conversation where we can laugh about certain things and go, it's like they've got a textbook. It's like they've gone out and bought this textbook and gone,
Literally.
okay. And because that's where the threads come from. So I know when I worked for the domestic abuse charity I worked for, sitting in group facilitation, and it was like light bulbs going off, people going, oh my God, yeah, that happened. Oh yeah, that happened. Well, slightly different, but it's such thing. And it's like they've gone out and bought a textbook and gone, here we
No,
go.
literally.
Yeah,
It is,
frightening.
isn't it? And I think, like I said, the language used, and again, taking it back to that family court, the language used,
Yeah,
again, through my own experience, I was just, you know, obviously very naive going into it, don't get me wrong, thinking it, you know, justice will prevail, truth is
yeah.
the truth, evidence is quite clear, etc. But obviously not having that experience at all, being completely invalidated on an individual level as well as my child, which, you know, is another story.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I think the
That's another
language,
episode.
yeah, exactly. But no, like you said, the language that's used is just really, really consistent, despite the differences, or I can imagine the differences in cases and, you know, personalities, you know, situations as a whole. The language that's used within the family court, i.e., you know, everything's historic, you're being obstructive, lots of different things like that. I'm like, everyone I speak to, quite literally, everyone I've spoken to has like, oh yeah, they called me that as well. Yeah, they said that about my domestic abuse as well. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm not saying it's right because it's absolutely not, but it kind of gives you a little bit of peace of mind to know that actually it's not just me. Like, because there was point as for myself, and I'm sure many people out there as well, that you think it's my fault, I've done something wrong, I am the only one that's going through this. And when you feel like that, it's a really lonely place because you don't know where to turn to, because you're like, well, no one else is going to understand, no one's going to get it, it is me, so how can I explain that? I don't want to put myself out there because people are going to think I've been silly, or I'm wrong, or whatever that looks like in your own sort of narrative. I think the more we can, again, go back to having these conversations, just say, actually, the system as a whole needs a lot of reform, and that is
Yes.
putting it very mildly, I
Yeah, I
think.
was just going to say you're being very polite there.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I think, like things like this podcast, Lucy, it's just about people understanding that they're not alone, I think. And I think that's really key in domestic abuse situations, where you're going through maybe the judicial system, whether it's child contact arrangements, I think it's just having that community to reach out to that gets it. And sadly, we sometimes can't fix it in the moment, but it's just having that understanding that actually, there's lots of us, sadly, there's lots
Yeah.
of us that have been through or going through the same.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you, because the reason I started this was because I knew that in terms of funding, there is only, if anybody knows, if anyone's been through the system of support, then it only lasts for so long. And that is no reflection on the services that are out there. Their hands are tied, they're doing the best they can. But support can't go on forever. So I thought there needs to be somewhere where someone can revisit something time and time again. Because again, like we said before, it can be taking the steps back and taking the steps forward. And if you need to listen to something like this, and say to yourself, okay, right, I need a bit of a self-check here. I need to remember that I'm not to blame, whatever it is you need to hear. And I think that it is important to have these free resources out there for people that they can access this information and know that they're not alone. And especially the reason I thought of it initially was I thought, for those lying in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning going, I can't just ring my support worker, I can't just speak to my advert at 3 in the morning, but I'm lying here and I can't sleep. And I've got, for example, family court tomorrow, whatever it is. To
Yeah.
know that you can listen to something that may just help you get through those next few hours, to me, was crucial in making any kind of change.
Oh, definitely. And I think sometimes, like you said rightly, it's a real slow progress, isn't it? It can feel like that, and everyone's journey is different, don't get me wrong, but it's as you said, 24/7. there is
Yeah.
there is always someone, I do believe that, whether that's like Samaritans or friends,
Yes. Yeah.
family, or like you said, something like this. But for most of us, we don't want to think outside that box because we don't want to perhaps be a burden. We don't want people to kind of, in my head anyway, just to give you, I guess, my own narrative that was many years ago, I used to think, well, I'm being a burden, everyone
Yeah.
else has got their own issues, they don't have time to hear mine, I'm going to upset people if I tell them how I feel, etc., etc. But for me now, having gone through that self-reflective stage, shall we say, for me personally, yes, other people have problems, but actually, problem shared is a problem halved, that kind
Yeah.
of famous phrase. And taking myself to how would I want a friend to kind of deal with their own issues, I would always want someone to come to me to talk to me if they were feeling alone or lost or overwhelmed, whatever that looks like for them. I would always want someone I care about to come to
Yeah.
me, whether it was 3 in the morning or
Yeah.
whatever time of day or night. And
Yeah.
now I always kind of treat myself with that same respect. Actually, my friends I know want to be there for me, they've offered that support.
Yeah.
Initially I was like, no, they're just saying that because
Yeah.
they was actually, now I know they do, and it works both ways. And I think for anyone that may feel alone, whether they, sadly maybe don't feel they've got friends or family they can turn to, as you said, Lucy, there's things like this, the podcast they can tap into. Or yeah, there was genuinely, I believe, always someone that wants to listen. As much as in
Yes.
that moment you may feel there's not, I do believe there is organizations or support network out there for everyone, and especially with the online world now as well, it's
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
um,
Yeah, you're right.
education.
You're right.
But yeah,
Yeah. And it's important to know that there are professionals out there who want to listen, who we have the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, like you say, we have Samaritans, it's incredible. And it's to know that you're not being a burden. You know,
Yeah,
that's people do these jobs and go into these roles because they want to help,
yeah,
you know,
exactly
and
that,
I
isn't it?
think in some ways, as a kind of maybe a nice positive, as part of the conversation around domestic abuse, is the people that work in the DA world are very often either impacted by it somehow themselves, not necessarily directly, it may be through family or friends, whatever it is. Um, but that gives them, to me, in some ways, like the superpower of having that insight and going, this is why I'm not just doing this because it's a job that I feel like I need to pay the bills. There's a real sense that people who work in this area want to help and
Literally.
want to, you know, make that difference. And we are making those progressions slowly, and it is taking time. But talking to somebody the other day who came on the podcast, Duncan Craig, and we were talking about, you know, his experience, say 20 years ago to where we are now. You know, it's massive, it's huge, but it's still not enough. We still need to keep going. And like you say, if we could just start the whole family court process from scratch, that would be amazing. But yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think, like you said, I think there's so many of us that, lived it. And again, I would say I don't wish this upon anyone, don't get me
no,
wrong, make that clear. But I think when you've lived it, there is a different level of understanding, isn't there, and compassion and care. And I think
yeah,
for people, I often wish when I was in it, if I had someone, something to turn to where I was like, oh, they've been through it, they get it,
yeah,
or even that educational piece, just to kind of know what that even looked like. Because me, I didn't know till I left the relationship what coercive control even was. I didn't actually even know the phrase, actually, like,
no,
oddly or not. I didn't never heard of that, never come across it. And it's only till afterwards, all in hindsight, that you kind of look back and start to put those pieces of the puzzle
pieces.
together.
Yes, yeah,
Which is quite, say, fascinating, obviously, and it sounds a bit odd saying that, but quite sort of fascinating from a psychological point of view. And I was speaking to like a friend the other day who's been through similar, and she was like, well, actually, it's understanding where that perpetrator's coming from in terms of how they've been taught particular
yes,
behaviour, maybe childhood. Is there something that is in their past that means they are like they are now? And it's not in a sense of let's forgive them and that's fine then and that's acceptable or okay that they have treated you like that. But for me, that level of, I guess, understanding and forgiveness for my own sake rather than theirs has given me real peace of mind. Just to,
yeah,
again, going back to that, it wasn't me. I couldn't have changed it. They've been taught that, sadly, through their own childhood experiences, and that's maybe perhaps normal to
yeah,
them.
yeah,
And then I've been, as sadly a lot of us are in the middle of that, trying to almost fix that kind of narrative for them, I guess, in terms of, well, just, if do you not understand that, or if I do this, will you do that kind of conversations? Is actually, I think it's actually releasing yourself, isn't it, from that
yeah,
pressure.
yeah,
I don't need to fix them. I sadly need to let them be, let them go. But I
yeah.
need to work on myself to regain my sometimes new identity. We don't always go back to the person we were before abuse, and to work on yourself, you know,
Yeah.
through forgiveness of what has happened, for your own peace of mind.
That is incredibly true, and you know, you just touched on it there with the idea of forgiveness, and you know, it isn't about having to forgive the person that has done these, I can only describe as heinous things to another human being, and to somebody, especially if children are involved, you know, the other parent of these children that you've created. um it's about forgiving yourself, you know, and that we come back to that, don't we, again, around the self-blame, the guilt, all of that. And actually all you have done is been genuine, you
Yeah,
know, and that's not something to
exactly
be
that,
ashamed of,
isn't
that's
it?
something to be
Mm.
proud of. But it doesn't feel like that when you're going through it. But it is, I think, again, we're going right back to the beginning of the conversation where you were saying it's those steps, it's those very small steps, and those accepting that things will eventually change, but it's taking that time and self-help. You're 100%. Do you know, it's funny, it's something that we hear a lot about, but we don't tend to talk about it enough in this arena. And I think it's because a lot of the time people think, well, I'll just go and talk to a specialist about this, and that's fine, that's brilliant, that's wonderful. But what happens when that person isn't there? It's where you have to then, like you say, look within and say, okay, whatever it is, make a cup of tea. I've made a cup, I got out of bed. That's a
Yeah,
positive. That's
literally,
a
isn't it?
step. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's those real small steps which, at the time it kind of seems like nothing, but I think we need to really emphasize those small steps are like really amazing. I think, I don't want to sort of patronize people by saying that, but I think, some days, we don't even want to get out of bed after abuse or even during abuse. We don't have that strength or that mental capacity, physical capacity to want to face the day, because of how we've been treated and kind of, the mental state of mind really after abuse. And I think just the fact we can get out of bed should be a huge congratulations to ourselves, and the fact that, perhaps, I think I'm a firm believer in, just like I said, 3 days, just almost ending the day, or three times
Yeah.
a day, should I say, ending the day on three things that we've achieved in that day.
I love that.
And that's kind of like the gratitude piece. But then also I've started to practice in recent years, kind of also ending the day with a kind of, again, it's all done in my head, but I know some people write it down, but just kind of thinking to myself, what do I want to achieve tomorrow? Again, can be simple. Do I want to have a shower? Do I want to go meet a
Yeah.
friend for a coffee? Do I want to get a bit of fresh air? And when I first left my marriage, I was almost scared to go outside because, again, going back to that shame and guilt feeling. But I used to step outside my back door, and one of my sort of things I tried to make myself do was just take 10 deep breaths every morning,
Yes.
10 deep breaths every night, which, again, may sound really menial, but in that moment, to me, that was like, oh, I've achieved that today. And it's just building on that, isn't it? And
Yeah.
some days I probably wouldn't achieve anything, but I knew tomorrow was a fresh start, another day, and we see what tomorrow brings. It's just literally, taking it day by day, isn't
I
it?
I genuinely could not agree with you more. And I think when we pull it back to the basics like that, it's so true. And I used to have this quote from, I used to love the Anna Green Gables books, Lucy Maud Montgomery, and there's a line in there that says, tomorrow's always fresh with no mistakes in it. And that's something that's sustained me over the years. Is okay, so today I didn't achieve, like you say, what I wanted to. I feel like I've failed. Actually, no, I've not, because there's, and that hope. I think hope's a massive aspect, isn't it?
Oh
It is.
yeah, definitely. The hope that things will change. And I do believe that, again, I'm not many people, some people may get this, some people may not, but I'm quite spiritual, and I do think the universe has a plan for us.
Yeah.
And whether, we've been through this as a CAPS collective, and obviously in the moment it's really, really hard, isn't it? Don't get me wrong. But I think as that journey progresses to a slightly more positive lifestyle and mindset, etc., I think we can then use our sort of lessons, shall we say, to teach others. And I believe for myself personally, I've been through what I've been through to kind of help other people. And this is part of the kind of the grand plan for me on an individual basis. And I get
Yeah.
people watching this may think, well, that's a bit insensitive. And I don't mean it that way at all,
Right.
trust me. But I think often, the universe has our back and everything is temporary. And I know with all the challenges I faced, I had my daughter taken away from me in 2023. And that for me was the lowest of the low. And I thought, how the hell am I ever going to come back from this? But I have done. And now my life is a million times better than it probably was even before. But I'd never, 2 years ago, or even 18 months ago now, I would never have envisaged that. But I just want to say to anyone watching this, it is moments of kind of miracles sometimes, or moments of kind of those small steps towards progression, that actually things can change. And I think everything is temporary and it does get better. It's just having that patience and that self-belief. And as you said, Lucy, the hope and the faith that things will change in time.
Do you know what? I think you've summed it all up perfectly. I do. I do. I think you're incredible. Just to put that out there. And the fact that you can talk in the way that you do about your experience, to me, is that hope aspect for others to be able to think, okay, so there is hope. There is hope. There is, if I can look at Michelle and say, all right, okay, so she is doing this. She has techniques and ways of thinking. Like you say, there is, I definitely believe there's purposes and plans for people, 100%. And sometimes we might not like the purpose we've been given. We might go,
No,
that seems
exactly
very
that.
fair.
Yeah.
I'd rather have been a millionaire, or
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
but I'll take it. But there is definitely, you're right. You're 100% right. And I think you've just given so much brilliant advice. You've done it in a lovely, sensitive way as well, which, having spoken to you a few times now, I know that that's you as a human being as well. And I think from all of this, to remember that we're all human beings and we need to give ourselves a little bit of a break now and again. Yeah, you've been incredible. I'm so
Oh no, it's lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
I need you back on when the chapters come out. We'll book something in the future and we can have a chat about that. And
That would be
yes,
brilliant. I could
and
talk
that's
to you all day, but I
oh,
think
we could. I know, and I wonder why I lose my voice sometimes. But anyway,
yeah,
I don't mind. All
exactly,
for a good
exactly,
cause.
exactly. No, it's been a pleasure, Lucy. So thank you so
Oh,
much.
thank you so much.
Where